Ever since watching the movie Now You See Me, I've been obsessed with throwing cards. And recently, I learned how to throw both throwing stars and throwing knives. And when I went back to throwing cards, it just wasn't good enough. So in this video, I solved that problem. You see, I had a bit of a think and I thought, how would I make throwing cards better? Metal. That's how I'm going to make it better.
To start this project, we got a normal playing card and traced it over a leftover piece of metal from my armor set. If you want to watch that video, link will be in the description. Anyway, I cut it out and then proceeded to cut 3 more out. In total, we're going to make 4 cards. And here they are, still quite sharp, especially at the corners. I want to try and round those off so then it's like a playing card, but not too much that it's too small. After grinding those away, it was time to deal with these sharp edges. I wanted to make them more slick, kind of like the edge of a knife. But I made a bit of a mistake, and you'll see why later. And that's about all there was to making the cards itself. So now it's time to design them. To start with, we're going to spray them down with a coat of white paint. We're going to get this bit of rope, cut it up, and then cut it into smaller pieces, which will then be laid over the cards for a bit of a cool design. After laying them out over the cards, it was time to spray them black. Gave them a quick spray over and left them to dry. Unfortunately, the paint cracked on one of them, but I think it looks pretty cool. Next, we're adding in a clear coat. This is just to protect the paint so it doesn't scratch. After adding that on, I let it to dry and it cracked all of them, which was a happy accident because I think they turned out perfect. Anyway, time to turn them over and it's time to put the design on the other side of the card. This time when painting them, we started off with a black coat, but unfortunately it started raining and the water got onto the cards before they'd finished drying. So I had to remove this paint. To remove it, I went and got a bottle of methylated spirits and started wiping down the cards. But I had to be very careful as I didn't want to wipe the back design off because I thought that turned out perfectly and I didn't know how to remake the cracked paint look. After wiping away all the paint, it was time to repaint them, this time with a black coat. After they dried, I went and got these cards and cut out each of the symbols on them. I then taped out the cutout cards on top of the metal ones, getting them ready to paint. Now because I had 4 cards and there were 4 different suits, I used 1 ace from each suit. And now it was time to paint them. I sprayed them down and now it was time to see how they turned out. Unfortunately, a few of them didn't work out that well, but some of them turned out perfectly. The 2 that didn't work out well, I quickly fixed up with a little bit of paint, both white and black, let them dry, and it was time to apply the clear coat. I don't know how this works, but I mixed white and black together and got blue on my hands. You see, now earlier I said this was a mistake, and that's because I had to do it again after painting it, and I was afraid I'd weaken the metal. There's the end of making them. There was only one step left to do, and that was to sharpen them. So I went and got a whetstone, took them out the back, and put a little bit of olive oil on the stone. I've never used a whetstone before, and in fact I've never sharpened anything before. So if you're judging my technique, I'm sorry. I'm kind of just making it up as I go along. And I did an alright job. I got them decently sharp enough for this.
And this is them. Unfortunately, they didn't turn out perfect. The spades and the diamonds turned out perfect, but unfortunately, the clubs and the hearts didn't turn out that well. This is the back, and I'm so happy how they all turned out. I'm glad they all cracked like this, and I think it's because of the clear coat I used.
Now it's time to use them. I set up my throwing target and went to throwing, and they stuck in perfectly. They were so satisfying and made this nice crisp noise. And here are all the cards. You just hold them in your hand, pull back, flick, and they fly. Now let's have a look at them side by side with a real card. First thing you'll notice is the weight. Obviously a metal card is going to be heavier. The next thing you'll notice is the shape. You see my corners were a little bit too more round and I should have been more clear with my cuts, making them straighter, but it's still pretty good. And the last thing to compare them with is their width. You see, I didn't consider this when I started making them, but I accidentally grabbed metal that was the same width, so that was a happy little accident. Oh, and also looking at the design, I think I did great on this card. You can clearly tell what it's meant to be. As for the back, I feel like my back is better, as it's more unique. I mean, there is one more way we can compare them, and that's by throwing them. But there was no competition, as when I threw the metal cards, they actually went in the target. But when they didn't go on the target, they held up great. They bounced off the ground, they didn't get any dents, and for the paint scratch, it was very minimal. But when they did go in, it was so satisfying to watch, and I love seeing how deep they went. Alright, now it's time to compare them to other throwing things.
Well, let's start with the throwing knife. The throwing knife, although it's the most satisfying when you get it right, it was the hardest to throw, and it hit the ground the most out of all three of these.
Might I add, watching this back, the throwing knives were the worst when they hit the ground because they made a horrible racket. Compared to the throwing stars and the throwing cards, not nearly as loud.
Now when using the two of these, you're more likely to cut yourself on the card, but that's a totally different story when we look at the star. You see, because it's a star, it's a lot more awkward to hold. There's a lot of pointy ends and it's just sharper than the throwing card. It's weird to hold and hard to pick up. And the main benefit of the throwing card over the throwing star is when it hit the ground. You see, the throwing star hit the ground not as much, but when it did, it damaged the blades. The blades have been bent a little bit, while the throwing card is fine and it's still ready to be thrown again. Now, out of the three, there was one more thing I wanted to compare them. And that was how they looked. I'm obviously going to say the cards look the best because I made them, but genuinely, I think the cards do look the best, especially after being thrown. The knives look the worst, they look all scratched up. The stars still look awesome, but the cards, they look the exact same.
Alright, now earlier I already said my sharpening abilities were atrocious, but let's put that to the test. We're first going to test the sharpness of a knife against paper, and it turned out fine. I mean, it was a bit hard to hold the paper.
When testing the sharpness of these cards, there's two things I want you to consider. One, I'm not good at sharpening things. That was the first time I've ever used a whetstone and the first time I've ever had to sharpen anything. And I'm pretty sure I did it wrong. And second, this is after I've thrown them. I probably should have done the test before throwing them, but I didn't think of it till afterwards. Oh, by the way, speaking of which, they held up great throwing. Like they bounced off the ground many times. Not nearly as many times as the throwing knives, but they still bounced off the ground a lot and they lasted a long time. None of them have any significant dents. A few of them are missing little scratches of paint. Besides that, they've done a fantastic job of holding up. Right, so it's the end of the video. Not quite sure how to finish this one off, but I'm trying to hit 300 subscribers by the end of the year. Got 1 week to do it, and I need 300 more. I don't know if it's going to happen, but every subscription helps. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I'm going to be making more things soon. I've got some great ideas, so stick around to find out. Thanks for watching.